Hi, everyone, and welcome to this CCAG climate conversation. I'm your host, Clover Hogan. Today, we are going to be shining a spotlight on one of the most important yet often misunderstood pieces of the climate puzzle, nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. Now, NDCs are at the heart of the Paris Agreement. They represent each country's commitment to reduce emissions and to adapt to the impacts of the climate crisis. However, existing plans fall far short of what's needed, and current policies are steering us toward more than 3 degrees of global heating, which we know is a devastating scenario for both people and ecosystems. Now, the deadline for countries to submit their NDCs for 2035 was back in February of this year, 2025. Yet over 90% of countries missed this deadline. So the submission window has now been extended until the end of September. And that makes this moment here especially pivotal. The NDCs that are currently being tabled will set the tone for the ambition or inaction in the months that are leading up to COP30. And that is why this conversation is so incredibly important. We're going to be unpacking what the NDCs actually are, why they're so important, and critically, how we bridge this gap between ambition and implementation. And most crucially, we're also going to be exploring how wealthier nations can not only strengthen their commitments, but also support more ambitious action in lower income and also climate vulnerable countries. So I can think of no two better people to join me for today's conversation. With us, we have Sir David King, who is the former Chief Scientific Advisor for the UK government and founder and chair of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group. And we have Russell Howard-Reid, a conservationist, a climate activist, a writer, and founder of Geographer, a creative organization that is driving artist-led cultural engagement in the environmental movement. So thank you to both David, or Dave, and Russell for joining us. Now, Dave, I would love to start with you. To ensure that we are all on the same kind of page, I'd be really keen if you could kick us off with the very simple basics of what an NDC actually is and why it's so important.
The nationally determined contribution idea is central to actions on climate change at a global scale. This was all agreed ahead of 2015 when we had the major COP meeting in Paris, in which it was 195 nations agreed on action to stay, if at all possible, below 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level. How do we achieve that? Governments were each asked in advance what they could contribute to reducing emissions. How do we defossilize the global economy? We have to work through countries, and each country therefore submits its nationally determined contribution. Now, when I say that, the Climate Crisis Advisory Group has produced 3 reports on nationally determined contributions, and the latest report really focuses on driving prosperity and stability for each country. The latest report is advice for every government on how to incorporate NDCs into all of government actions. And when I say driving prosperity and stability, what we're saying is that climate action must be positioned as the fundamental economic development strategy of our time. Enhancing energy, resource, food security, and living conditions for all must be built into the NDCs. We need to be building healthy, resilient communities. And as we move forward, we've got to avoid any expense going into future stranded assets, by which I mean, if we keep, for example, focusing on developing new oil discoveries, I believe these will be future stranded assets because we won't need oil as we move away from fossil fuels. So future-proofing well-being is a key part of these NDC strategies. We must ensure effective and equitable implementation as well. If we don't, we can set out a wonderful program, but if it's not implemented and if the structure of government isn't focused around implementation, we see often failure. What is required at this point in time, because we are living through an era of compounding risks. I barely need to say this now. Geopolitical fracture, economic strain, and massively increasing climate impacts. Now we must see much better action and ambition from every country in the world.
Thank you, Dave. And on that theme of implementation, we are going to be discussing the implementation gap and where countries are falling short. But as a starting point, to kick us off on a more positive tone, because the
Right.
world feels so depressing right now, I'd be curious to hear from you. Where are we seeing genuine progress in actually turning those commitments into reality?
Let me take the extreme examples of countries that are doing very well. Which country has produced more electricity from renewables than any other source, and what percentage? So Norway leads the world at something approaching 90% of their electricity not using fossil fuels, produced not using fossil fuels. The other country, number two at 80%, is a big surprise to everybody, is Kenya. Kenya is at 80% of their electricity from renewable sources. They have wonderfully utilized geothermal energy that is available in their country. Many countries have geothermal energy available. Best practice needs to be switched from one country to another. Um, then let me just say, Financial Times recently produced a report on how countries are doing. And their report emphasized that because the post-fossil fuel world is already there, meaning that in the marketplace, it is now cheaper to put renewable electricity onto the grid than coal, gas, or oil, diesel, always more expensive to go down that route. So the marketplace is driving this transition in many parts of the world well. And I'm going to say Britain, the nationally determined contribution from Britain for 2035 is an 81% reduction compared with 1990. So what we're looking at in Britain is setting a trend, and we could say the same about Germany and France, and Japan is now reducing its emissions very rapidly. Each of these countries reducing, Britain is now at 55% reduction, and each of these countries has completely broken the amount of fossil fuel they use from GDP growth. Right, so as they've reduced emissions, they've also increased GDP growth, and for many of those countries, there's an increase in population, but still a fall. So it's not all bad news. The bad news is simply no country is doing enough. And yet, we do have the market in a position now to drive non-fossil fuel energy through right around the world. We do have a problem, and the problem is the fossil fuel lobby is so powerful, and they don't want to lose their business.
Thank you so much, Dave. Now, Russell, I would love to bring you in to the conversation now because you have led some really exciting and ambitious work in getting politicians to really up their commitments on NDCs, particularly when thinking about who gets a seat at the table and who gets to shape these outcomes. So I'd love to hear from you now a little bit about this work and also what prompted you as an activist to really focus on NDCs as a mechanism for change.
Absolutely. So, for the past 2 years, going on three, I have been leading all youth delegations to the UN climate and biodiversity negotiations with Nile Rodgers' We Are Family Foundation. And our goal in these delegations is to get young people into decision making rooms and at decision making tables with the basic understanding that, we deserve a seat at the table in determining what our own future will look like. And that is not only a matter of equity, as I'm sure we'll get into later, but it's also a pragmatic way of reaching the ambitions being set. But in the other, 360 days of the year where I'm not attending these climate conferences, I have been working in the field in conservation and for the past 2 years in a highly challenging conflict context. And what I've seen very clearly is what many of us do, that there's a huge gap between multilateral conversations and ambitions being set and nuances being debated and numbers being thrown around at these meetings, and then a huge disconnect with what's actually being seen in country, in context, in what is really being followed through on. And that's as true as it in the United States, where I'm currently based, as it was, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I was working. We are seeing this huge disconnect across the board. So it was a little over a year ago, I have to admit, that I really learned what the NDCs were. It was one of many three-letter words, I call them, that you hear about in these technical settings. And I really didn't know in great detail what they were. But as the conversation started picking up with the deadline approaching and I learned more about it, the NDCs seemed like this perfect opportunity, like really the technical bridge between these big conversations and actual in-country implementation. And as someone who was attending these negotiations to see real work, to see real impact, and really viewing the negotiations as a means to the end of promoting intergenerational justice, it felt like a really exciting opportunity. So within just a few weeks, I worked together with amazing people at We Are Family Foundation, as well as Christiana Figueres' Groundswell and Care About Climate, an amazing youth climate activist organization with a bunch of amazing partners who jumped in quite quickly, including CCAG, to launch the campaign for the NDC Youth Clause, ensuring that we actually codify some of the commitments made in places like Paris and places like ACE, that we actually codify youth inclusion and intergenerational collaboration in national climate plans.
That's brilliant. And yeah, I'm continually impressed by the pace with which you launched the NDC Youth Clause. And did you want to share a little bit about what the process has since looked like in terms of countries adopting the Youth Clause, what some of those kind of conversations have looked like?
Well, I have learned a lot. I really am not a policy person despite this work, so it's been a fascinating process. But one of the really illuminating components here is seeing how much and what the NDCs mean to different countries, where they're being written, with how much attention, with how much resourcing. And so, at launch, there was a ton of momentum because all of the right people are together in one room, in this case in Azerbaijan. But after leaving, figuring out who was actually working on NDCs, figuring out how they were being written, it was and continues to be, almost a year in now, a bit of a needle in a haystack process. And that has been really interesting because it's shown just how much of a gap there really is, speaking to that earlier point, just how often this disconnect is revealing itself. At the same time, it is also showing that there's really important work to be done here. Seeing that these climate plans are in many cases having ultimately presidential sign off, seeing that a lot of that complexity is because, different congresses, parliaments, different in-country governmental processes are engaged and learning about and having to, debate and ultimately agree to a united climate plan. It's exactly the kind of work, it's exactly where that focus is needed. So it's been exciting to see. It has also been a fascinating learning experience in just seeing where climate politics sit outside of the multilateral processes and, better and worse in different countries for sure.
Absolutely. And you mentioned this kind of implementation gap and the stark reality of what countries may be espousing and then what's actually being implemented on the ground. So Dave, I would love to bring you back in here. The question I'm going to ask you could probably spend hours answering because it's so layered, but I'd love to hear from your perspective. What are the biggest kind of obstacles to implementation, appreciating that it's going to be different on a case-by-case basis. And as a follow-up to that, what are the kind of accountability systems that we need in this space to ensure that NDCs aren't just empty promises?
Okay, you're right. That's a pretty and then the answer could be far too long. So obstacles to implementation in country are often vested interests, and vested interests come in different forms. So, for example, in countries like South Africa, Nigeria, countries, India, which have a vast amount of coal resource, and where the number of people employed in the coal mining and adjacent industries is large, these countries are really required to retrain coal miners into the new renewable energy stream, preferably, or into other jobs. The whole point is not to create unemployment by just switching off the use of coal. So there is a real problem there. And I mean, for example, I have talked to the trade union movement working in the coal mines in South Africa. It's a very difficult discussion to have, because people who've all their lives, their families have been working in coal mines. It's difficult. Here in the UK, by the way, we've experienced that. All of our electricity since the Industrial Revolution has come from coal, and coal mining was a major industry across the big stretches of the UK. So we lost those jobs. The jobs have now been recreated, but it wasn't an easy transition. The second element of vested interests is something I've mentioned just a moment ago, the industries where the profits come from coal, oil, and gas mining, and then selling it off. Now, these industries are extremely powerful, profits in the region of $1 trillion a year. At the beginning of the Ukraine war, their profits increased to $3 trillion a year. So we're looking at a vested interest that is empowered by finance, and that is a very powerful obstacle. But having said all that, there is a lot of good news around. I don't want to say that these obstacles to implementation are total. What is very, very important, and it's difficult to have a conversation like this without referring to the new presidency in the United States, who is completely against all action on climate change. He would like to shut down wind turbines. He doesn't like wind turbines near his golf course in Scotland. He's tried to ban them there. He's not just unhelpful, he's trying to block progress on climate change. Now, I'm just going to say something that Russell may find a bit difficult to take. 1992 is when negotiations began. If the United States had decided at that point in time to throw itself behind the negotiations, we would already have had an agreement. So we have not had leadership on this issue from the United States. I would say second period of Obama, yes. Biden recently, yes. But neither have been showing a global leadership position. So what is missing here is, how do we now battle with Russia, with the United States, with the Arab states? There's a difficult cohort that are behind this. And the answer has to be, all willing nations need to do even more. Let these guys catch up once we've developed our economies in a fit form for the 21st century. I mean, what is so important to understand is these roadmaps, including NDCs, are a roadmap for the 21st century development of all countries. Right? We move away from the massive risks we're facing on climate change only by going down these new roadmaps. I didn't answer your second question, but
we can circle back.
Okay.
I also want to circle back in a moment to the finance equation. I always feel way in over my head talking about global finance systems, but as you said, there's such an important mechanism to kind of understand and expose when talking about what's driving a lot of these kind of vested interests and slowing down progress. But before we get to that question, I wanted to bring you back in, Russell, to talk about this kind of the disparity between countries specifically, and the fact that you've been having conversations with a wide variety of different political stakeholders in different countries. We've seen that, you know, some of the world's biggest emitters submit very weak pledges, and we've seen a lot of backsliding, while some of the more vulnerable countries to climate change have in fact put some of the most kind of ambitious and bold plans forward, in spite of having very limited resources. So just from your perspective of, you know, your experiences in activism, the conversations you've been having around the NDC Youth Clause, what do you think this kind of disparity reveals in relation to fairness and specifically kind of global responsibility when we're talking about action on climate?
I mean, it must be said plainly that what we see in this moment, what we see with the NDCs and this gap in ambition, is exactly reflective of what we know about the climate crisis, about its core injustice, which is that those least responsible for it will invariably also be those who suffer the most at its bleeding edges. And we see this in individual communities, within individual countries, and we also absolutely see it in this international context. And so with that basic premise, it is unsurprising, yet always disappointing, Dave, to your point, to see my own country, to see many of the countries with the most impact, the most effect in the negative direction, and therefore the most ability to set us on the right course, to see this lack of action is an obvious continuation of climate injustice. At the same time, what is interesting, I've lived in and out of LA the last few years, and I was there during the wildfires. And what you see in that moment, what it really reflected to me was the way that the world has become the front line. I think you look back to 1992, you look back much, much further, and as the climate crisis was developing and taking its root, I would say that root begins with, the global colonization. Ever since then, it has grown and grown in size, and it has become a larger and larger problem. That is something that indigenous communities, frontline communities, communities that experienced colonization and have experienced violence at these sort of source communities, whether those are mining communities, you name it, they have known there is a climate crisis. They have witnessed the climate crisis before it maybe even had a name. What has happened more recently because of inaction, especially, Dave, again, to your point from 1992, is that front line has continued to close in, and now the front line is the world. And so we all very clearly see now what scientists have warned us and frontline communities have warned us of for generations, which is that we are all in really hot water now. And so there's tension brewing even in some of these conservative institutions as these consequences become real. And I hope, to give an optimistic kind of point on this, what I hope is that the communities that I've been engaging with that are representing smaller countries, that are reaching these higher ambitions, we've seen amazing youth inclusion on NDCs from places like Kenya. We expect to see that from the Dominican Republic, Liberia, just to name a few that we're in conversation with. You see a tremendous amount of ambition. You also see a lot more justice and inclusion written into these NDCs than you often see elsewhere. And I think that this represents an exciting opportunity if we all in this room know that we will need climate action, that we will need to reach this point of ambition, that we do need an energy transition. Perhaps there's this opportunity here for us to start seeing that the knowledge hierarchies, well represented in places like the United Nations, these ongoing power hierarchies that place wealthy Western knowledges and institutions as inherent leaders in this world, as they continue failing and we see leadership from elsewhere, places that might be surprising to those in these rooms, we have an opportunity for a real shift in how this is built. We're seeing the action and the ambition from the people who are given very little power, and there's going to be the point where countries, even my own, need to follow suit.
Thank you, Russell. And yeah, to your point, I think my home country of Australia is a very, clear example of a country that is highly vulnerable to the climate crisis. We've seen that with wildfires, increased flooding events, coral bleaching, ocean acidification. And yet, we are one of the wealthiest countries, and we're also one of the highest emitters per capita. And while our government is, saying one thing and on the surface kind of upping its climate ambitions, it is at the same time continuing to approve new gas licenses, for example, that extend all the way, to 2070. So there's a real discrepancy between what a lot of leaders are kind of espousing and then what's actually happening on the ground in terms of that decision making. And within that conversation, it's impossible to separate finance and the huge kind of financial machine that is continuing to fund fossil fuel infrastructure, subsidize the entire industry, even while renewables are reaching market tipping points. So, Dave, I wanted to bring you back in here to talk about, the fact that finance is so often this kind of make or break for climate negotiations. From your perspective, what is the role that finance does need to play in enabling ambition and critically that kind of implementation? And also through this kind of global lens that we've been touching on, what does that effective financial support look like from wealthier countries in relation to countries that don't have the same kind of resources for a just transition?
You're putting your finger now on the most difficult challenge of all. 2015, it was agreed amongst many nations, this wasn't part of the agreement, but $100 billion a year was needed to transition from developed countries to developing countries to enable them to do this. And a fund was created. That fund has never approached that $100 billion a year. The intention was that this would be public money. There was then much discussion about including private money, etc. The fund is much less than the figure that was set in 2015. But today, that figure is more like $1 billion a year. If you actually look at what is required country by country, in terms of what is needed in every part of the world is not just switching away from fossil fuels, it's managing resilience against the challenges that are already happening. You and Russell have both discussed these massive challenges in the world today. Let me just quickly point to the new information that's come out fairly recently over the last year. Arctic Circle region is losing ice so rapidly that in February this year, the North Pole hit a record temperature high of about 30 degrees centigrade, 30 degrees plus, right? That Arctic Sea has now got exposed to sunlight because the ice has melted very quickly when the summer arrives. And bingo, you've got very warm air above a lovely blue sea, which is soaking up sunshine during the polar summer months. Now, Nerily Abraham from your country, who's a member of CCAG, led a team of 21 people who published a very, very critical paper on the state of the Antarctic, where sea ice has been lost at record rates over the last 5 years. In 1 year, half of the sea ice was lost around the Antarctic. That ice protects ice on the Antarctic just as the ice in the North Pole region protects ice on Greenland. With both of these, if you take Greenland, we now know Greenland is losing 30 million tons of ice an hour, and that's an average for the last 10 years. That looks like the ice is melting irreversibly, giving rise to a potential sea level rise of 24 feet, 7.5 meters. There's not a country in the world that would manage a sea level rise of that kind without dramatic changes. So what we have now is a much better understanding of what the threats are. And there was a movie called Don't Look Up, and it is looking to me as if many people have now got their heads in the sand, this ostrich-like behavior. So coming back to finance, I'm going to regret to tell you that the British government has reduced its overseas aid twice in 2 periods with 2 different governments. The United States government is now in the process of decimating its overseas aid. So what we're looking at is a world where the economy is in difficulties. And a big part of that, of course, is the Russian-Ukraine war. Uh, and as we go forward in time, and let me just also mention the Middle East, we've got these 2 big crises, new crises in addition to previous crises. We are looking at a massive challenge, and I just pointed out earlier, the geopolitical situation is destabilized, and this is the difficult question around finance. So I really think we have to continue by working in the way, for example, that happened in Kenya, that 80% reduction in use of fossil fuels for electricity usage. They delivery. They managed that with engineers coming in helping to see how they could produce renewable energy from the fact that they have geothermal energy there. Right? It's a country where geothermal energy is readily available. Now, 80% of the electricity is produced from geothermal energy. That didn't take 10 years even to happen. Now, that wasn't an official grant of money. And I do think unofficial channels really need to be pursued and pursued by all countries that have these kinds of difficulties. Of course, the small island states have massive challenges. As we see sea levels rising, Vanuatu as a country will disappear. We see every small island state having massive challenges. Britain is an island state as well. We get smaller, but the United States, the East Coast, is under severe threat from rising sea levels. No country is going to be clear of the challenges we're facing. When we look at finance, we really need to see that we have a secure future, not only for future generations and young people like Russell, but for older people like myself too. It's happening right now.
Thank you, Dave. And on that theme of intergenerational justice and what this means for the next generation, Russell, from your perspective, how can bringing diverse voices, and particularly this next generation, into the conversation and into initiatives like the Universal NDC Youth Clause, how can they help to embed kind of intergenerational justice frameworks into the process? And why is it important, not just from the perspective of kind of the ethics and morality of this conversation, but purely from a pragmatic perspective as well, in terms of delivering solutions that actually work for the many and not just the few?
Right. Well, Dave, you mentioned earlier 1992, and 1992 has been on my mind quite a bit lately because we are now returning to Brazil for COP30. But really, what 1992 refers to, of course, is the Rio Earth Summit, which was the sort of original gathering that brings together countries for what we now know as the Conference of Parties, the COPs, the UN climate negotiations. And at that time, a pledge was made by those attending, and it was written in this beautiful artwork by Robert Rauschenberg, I pledge to secure or to ensure a secure and hospitable home for present and future generations. Obviously, that promise has not been kept. Clover, you and I weren't born then. I wasn't born personally for quite a few years after either. So we were that future generation. And it's quite obvious as we return to Brazil that many of us are now here inheriting a world that is not secure, not hospitable, and actually quite a bit less of each of those things than it was back in 1992. So there's this unkempt promise that is very obviously unjust to our generation and to those that will follow. And that is reason enough that we should have a seat at the table and that we should have a voice in determining what our futures look like. So I am fully bought into the justice perspective, to the equity perspective, to the fact that there's a moral obligation to bring young people into these rooms. That being said, when it comes to the NDCs, when it comes to climate action, there's also a very pragmatic reason for this, which is that bringing diverse voices together and actually bridging across generations builds better solutions. The solutions being currently, manufactured and debated by the very enduring age hierarchy by older generations, these solutions will need to be upheld by future generations, by ours and by those to come, currently voiceless, those, not even born. It makes no sense that we're building these solutions without the people who need to carry them forward. These ambitions will not be fulfilled if we don't have younger people in the room. And beyond that, young people bring nativity to the climate crisis. We bring a sense of urgency that is much greater, with a lot more to lose and a lot more to gain from figuring this out or not. And we also bring, ultimately, some of the largest climate movements in basically every country. We have a lot more movement building. We have a lot more fuel to our fire. And that is so often wasted on calling for ambition, trying to hold governments accountable, trying to get them to take more action and ambition. When we look to the NDCs, there is a big range in what ambition is being set, but in many cases, we are seeing more ambition, and we expect to see more ambition than we've seen in the past. What that creates is an opportunity to start thinking, okay, how do we actually reach that ambition? Beyond the multi-sectoral, which people love to talk about, I'm here entering the UN General Assembly and have seen about 1 million events on the schedule about the multi-sectoral collaboration needed. We also need intergenerational collaboration. It is vital that we start bridging the very real and very challenging gaps between generations in our approaches to the climate crisis and to everything. We need to do that work because we need all generations involved to finally actually take seriously that pledge. I think we can make it again now, that we as the future generation then, we're here now, we're present, we have voices, and we want to see this through. And so together, it's the call of the global mutirao. It's the goal that has been set by the Brazilian presidency for COP, for a whole of society collective action, for the climate crisis to be this unifying cause that brings us all together in a time of remarkable tribalism and division. And so if we can take that pledge together, if we can do that work now across generations, across borders, and across sectors, we have an opportunity to get this right. And it's gonna be harder. We know there's a lot of work to do, but Dave, you pointed out a lot of fantastic cases of what can be done and how easy it often is to get on the right track when we get people on the same page. And so really the NDC Youth Clause is a forward-looking mechanism to say, make this commitment now to move young people from being stakeholder consultation groups where, the day before you submit formal policy work, Clover, we've both been in these meetings many times, young people are brought in to say we were consulted, but actually looking at us as partners instead, to say we aren't just one of many groups that should be kind of appeased in some way, but actually seeing the value and power and influence that young people can bring. It's what the NDC Youth Clause is all about, and it's what we hope to see and are beginning to see in quite a few of the countries that we're working with.
Thank you, Russell. And it reminds me of that great quote from the We Are Family Foundation: problems that span generations require leadership that does too. And I think picking up on something else you touched on, as we're seeing so many of these kind of institutions fail to deliver on many of the promises that were, made previously, I think this moment is serving to also radicalize a lot of people who are kind of interested in, their governments or corporations to take action. This moment is really ripe for community organizing and for kind of unlikely partnerships and allyship, and people who perhaps have previously felt really powerless in the face of what is an enormous and often very complex crisis, to kind of dig deep and recognize where they can kind of step up in community in a meaningful way. So that is my, I suppose, maybe naively optimistic, but that is my hopeful take on what this moment could kind of give rise to. So I want to thank both of you so much for today's conversation. I have learned so much, and I know that the people tuning in today will have as well. As we've heard, NDCs are really the backbone of international climate action, but we also know that ambition without implementation is nowhere near enough. And to keep 1.5 degrees alive, we need not just clear plans, but we need stronger accountability and, above all, fairness too. We need wealthier nations stepping up with greater ambition, providing finance and support needed for lower income and climate vulnerable countries. And as you expressed so eloquently, Russell, we also need intergenerational justice, making sure that the voices of young people are not just heard, but in fact acted upon and centered in the decisions that are ultimately affecting our future and the futures of generations not even born. So thank you, Dave and Russell, for joining in this crucial conversation. Thank you to CCAG for hosting us, and thank you to everyone for watching.